Feldwebel Werner Krauss squints through the telescopic sight and watches the American half-track roll forward. The Sherman they killed 90 seconds ago sits 200 meters ahead, smoke pouring from the engine deck in thick black coils. The crew bailed out. One of them crawled into a ditch. The tank is dead. The crew scattered. Now this half-track appears from behind a hedgerow and drives directly toward the wreck. Krauss adjusts his grip on the traverse wheel. The vehicle has no gun, no turret, just an open bed, a winch mounted on the front, and 3 men visible above the cab. The driver parks it broadside to his position. The men climb out. This does not make sense. The German 75mm anti-tank gun that killed the Sherman still has a clear line of fire. The crew beside Krauss is already reloading. The half-track is softer than the Sherman. Thin armor, open top. A single well-placed round would turn it into scrap. And these Americans are walking around it like they are at a depot. One of them is unspooling cable from the winch. Another is walking toward the burning tank. The third is waving at someone behind the hedgerow. Krauss gives the order to traverse. The gun crew swings the barrel 5 degrees left. The half-track fills the sight. The loader slams a fresh round into the breech. Krauss puts his eye back to the optic and watches the American hook the cable to the Sherman's rear tow shackle. The tank is still on fire. The ammunition inside could cook off at any moment. The German gun is aimed directly at the recovery vehicle, and this man is attaching a tow cable. The gunner looks at Krauss. Krauss hesitates, not from mercy, from confusion. He has been fighting Americans for 3 weeks, seen them retreat under fire, seen them advance under fire. But he has never seen them ignore fire to salvage a knocked-out tank, while the gun that killed it watches from 400 meters away. The behavior does not fit any pattern he knows. For a moment, just a moment, he wonders if this is a trap, some kind of bait, some elaborate ruse to draw fire and reveal his position to American artillery observers. It is not a trap. There is no ruse. The Americans are simply hooking up a burning tank in the open because they intend to drag it back behind the hedgerow and repair it. This is the detail that German anti-tank crews in Normandy struggled to accept. Not just that Americans recovered their knocked-out vehicles, every army does that when possible, but that they did it immediately, under fire, before the engagement was even over, while the tank was still burning, while the gun that killed it was still in position. The recovery crews did not wait for nightfall. They did not wait for the line to advance. They drove forward, hooked up, and towed back. And if they lost the half-track, another one would come. If you've ever wondered why the Germans couldn't bleed the American armored divisions the way they bled the British in the desert, this is part of the answer. The Americans kept getting their tanks back. I want to know if you think this was courage, or logistics, or something else entirely. Leave a comment, hit subscribe, and stick around. The argument happens in the comments. Krauss fires. The round strikes the ground 3 meters short of the half-track, throws dirt across the recovery crew, and does nothing. One of the Americans ducks. The others keep working. The cable is secured. The half-track's winch begins to take up slack. The Sherman lurches backward, still burning, dragging a furrow in the soft Norman soil. A second round from Krauss's gun goes high. The half-track is already moving, reversing with the Sherman in tow, and the angle is closing fast. By the time the crew reloads a third time, the half-track has dragged the burning tank behind the hedgerow. The engagement is over. Krauss has expended 3 rounds of precious 75mm ammunition. He has nothing to show for it. The Americans have 1 burning Sherman that will be in a field repair shop by nightfall. This is not how war is supposed to work. You kill a tank, it stays dead. The crew bails out, runs, survives if they are lucky. The wreck sits in the field until someone bulldozes it into a ditch or strips it for parts after the line moves. The pattern holds on the Eastern Front, where Soviet tank losses mount into the thousands and stay lost. It holds in North Africa, where knocked-out vehicles litter the desert for months. But in Normandy, summer of 1944, the Americans have built something different. They have built a system that refuses to accept permanent loss. The recovery crew that Krauss watched was not brave in the way that medals are given for. They were not assaulting a position or saving a wounded comrade. They were mechanics. Ordnance soldiers. Their job was to hook up broken tanks and drag them to the rear. The fact that they did it under fire, in the open, with the gun that killed the tank still watching, that was not heroism. It was policy, doctrine. The Ordnance Corps deciding that a Sherman was worth more than the risk to a recovery crew, and the recovery crews accepting that math without argument. The boom on the M32 tank recovery vehicle weighed 1,100 pounds by itself. A lattice structure of welded steel, mounted on a pivot at the rear of the hull, capable of lifting a Sherman's entire power pack, engine, transmission, final drives, straight out of the engine compartment and setting it on the ground, like a man removing a drawer from a filing cabinet. The winch beneath it could pull 60,000 pounds. The vehicle itself was built on a Sherman chassis, with the turret removed and replaced by a fixed superstructure that gave the crew a place to stand while they worked. It had no main gun. The only armament was a single 81mm mortar mounted in the hull, not for fighting, but for laying smoke when the crew needed to disappear. This is what Krauss was shooting at. Not some improvised recovery rig bolted together in a field depot. A purpose-built machine that the United States Army had designed, tested, manufactured, and shipped across the Atlantic in numbers sufficient to assign them to every tank battalion in the theater. The M32 existed because someone in the Ordnance Department had decided, years before the invasion, that American tanks would be knocked out in combat, and that the Army would need a way to get them back faster than the enemy could replace his own losses. The Germans had nothing like it. Their standard recovery vehicle was the Panther, a Panther hull with the turret removed, and a spade at the rear for anchoring during winch operations. It was powerful. It could tow a Tiger. But there were never enough of them, because every Panther was a Panther that could not go to a tank battalion, and the Germans needed every Panther they could get. The decision to build a recovery vehicle meant accepting one fewer tank in the line. The Americans made that trade without hesitation. The Germans could not afford to. A single American armored division in Normandy typically had between 40 and 50 M32s assigned to its maintenance companies. That number does not appear in most accounts of the campaign. It is buried in the organizational tables, in the fine print of the division slice, in the kind of detail that historians skip because it does not involve combat. But those 40 vehicles meant that an armored division could lose a dozen Shermans in a single engagement and have most of them back in service within 72 hours. The crews who operated them were not tankers. They were ordnance soldiers, mechanics who happened to drive a vehicle that looked like a tank and went places. Tanks went. The mortar is worth a moment. It could fire smoke rounds at ranges up to 1,000 yards, which meant a recovery crew could lay their own concealment without calling for artillery support. The decision to include it tells you something about American planning. Someone had thought through the problem. Recovery crews would need to work in exposed positions without reliable infantry support, and waiting for a fire mission would cost time. So they gave the crew a way to make their own smoke. The mortar could also fire high explosive rounds, though the manual discouraged this. The M32 was not supposed to fight. It was supposed to survive long enough to drag something more valuable to safety. The crew Krauss was watching were not acting on individual courage. They were executing a procedure that had been written, trained, and rehearsed before they ever set foot in France. The Ordnance Corps had decided that tanks would be recovered under fire, and it had built a vehicle and a doctrine to make that possible. The crew's job was to follow the procedure: hook up, winch, reverse. The fact that rounds were landing nearby did not change the task. The fact that the tank was still burning did not change the task. The procedure assumed these conditions. The vehicle was designed for these conditions. The crew had been selected and trained for these conditions. A post-war German assessment, one of the Foreign Military Studies reports compiled by the U.S. Army Historical Division, contains a line that captures the German experience of this system. The author, a former Wehrmacht logistics officer, describes American recovery operations as conducted with a disregard for tactical conditions that bordered on recklessness. He means it as criticism. But the word he uses, recklessness, reveals the gap in understanding. It was not reckless. It was calculated. The Americans had done the math and decided that the risk to a recovery crew was worth the near-certain return of a repairable tank. The Germans, who could not replace their losses and could not build enough recovery vehicles to retrieve them, saw only the risk. They did not see the system that made the risk rational. The M32 had a crew of 4: driver, assistant driver, crane operator, and commander. None of them were volunteers in the heroic sense. They were soldiers assigned to a job, doing the job the way they had been trained to do it. The vehicle gave them the tools: the boom for lifting, the winch for towing, the mortar for smoke, the Sherman hull for protection against small arms. Doctrine told them what to expect of themselves. You go forward, you hook up, you bring it back. Logistics told them what to expect of the army. If you lose your vehicle, another one is coming. Krauss did not know any of this. He saw men behaving in ways that made no tactical sense. He did not understand that he was watching a system operate exactly as designed. Corporal Dwight Hessler drops from the half-track before it stops rolling. His boots hit soft ground, Norman soil churned by tank tracks and artillery, the consistency of wet bread. The Sherman is 40 meters ahead. Black smoke rises from the engine deck in a column that bends east with the wind. The crew that bailed out is somewhere behind the hedgerow. The Germans who killed the tank are somewhere ahead of him, and he cannot see them, but he knows they can see him. He walks toward the burning tank. This is the part that looks like madness from any distance. A man on foot, crossing open ground, approaching a vehicle that might cook off at any moment, while an anti-tank gun with a proven kill sits 400 meters away with a clear field of fire. Hessler is not running. Running attracts attention. Running looks like fear, and fear draws fire. He walks at a pace that suggests purpose without urgency, the walk of a man who has a job to do and intends to do it. The tow cable is already being fed out behind him. unspooling from the winch drum with a low mechanical whine. The smell hits him before he reaches the tank. Burning rubber, burning oil, the sharp chemical stink of smoldering paint. Underneath it, something else. The hot metal smell of a vehicle that has taken a penetrating round, superheated steel, and the faint sweetness of hydraulic fluid cooking off inside the hull. The Sherman's engine deck is buckled where the round went through. The flames are concentrated there, licking up through the louvers, not yet spreading to the ammunition storage in the hull. This is important. A tank with burning ammunition is a loss. A tank with a burning engine is a repair job. Hessler reaches the rear of the Sherman and kneels beside the tow shackle. The metal is warm, but not hot. The fire is forward, and the hull steel dissipates heat slowly. He threads the cable through the shackle and secures it with a clevis pin. His hands know the motion. He has done this dozens of times in training, a dozen more times in the field since Normandy began. The clevis pin slides home. He gives the cable a tug to seat it. He stands. The entire process takes 11 seconds. 11 seconds of standing beside a burning tank in an open field while a German gun crew watches. The tow shackles on a Sherman were forged from a steel alloy designated SAE 4340, a chromium molybdenum composition chosen for its resistance to fatigue under repeated stress. The same alloy was used in aircraft landing gear. The metallurgists who specified it were thinking about longevity, not combat. They wanted a shackle that would survive 10,000 hookups over the life of the vehicle. They were not thinking about a corporal standing next to one while rounds landed nearby. But the shackle's strength meant Hessler did not have to worry about whether it would hold. He could focus on the cable, the pin, the signal. Hessler raises his right arm, a vertical signal, visible from the half-track. The winch operator sees it and engages the drum. The cable snaps taut. The Sherman groans, shifts, begins to move backward. Hessler is already walking back toward the half-track, matching the pace of the tow, staying close enough to the cable to unhook it if something jams, but far enough to avoid being caught if it snaps. A cable under 60,000 pounds of tension will cut a man in half. The first German round lands while he is still in the open. It hits short, 3 meters, maybe 4. The concussion knocks dirt across his legs and throws a spray of mud against the Sherman's hull. Hessler does not drop. He does not run. He keeps walking. The half-track is 20 meters behind him now, reversing slowly, the cable feeding back onto the drum as the Sherman follows. The driver cannot go faster without risking a snag. The winch operator cannot accelerate without snapping the cable. The speed is fixed by the equipment. Hessler's job is to keep walking at that speed and trust that the German gunner will not find the range before the hedgerow covers them. The second round goes high. Hessler hears it pass. A sound like tearing canvas, the distinctive crack of a high-velocity shell displacing air faster than sound can follow. It impacts somewhere behind the hedgerow. The German crew is bracketing, adjusting between shots, but the half-track is moving, and the angle is changing, and they do not have time to walk the rounds onto target before the vehicles disappear. Hessler reaches the half-track and swings himself onto the running board. The assistant driver grabs his arm and pulls him up. The Sherman clears the hedgerow 7 seconds later, still burning, still trailing smoke, but out of the gun's line of sight. The engagement is over. Total time from dismount to cover, 43 seconds. 43 seconds of walking in the open, hooking a cable, signaling a winch, and walking back, all while a gun that had already killed one tank that day was trying to kill him. The German crew fired twice and missed twice, not because they were incompetent, but because the geometry changed faster than they could correct. By the time they had the range, the target was gone. This is what Krauss saw through his telescopic sight. This is what looked like recklessness. A man walking toward a burning tank like he was crossing a motor pool, attaching a cable like he was at a depot, walking back like the rounds landing around him were someone else's problem. Panic was not in the procedure. Hesitation was not in the training. The doctrine assumed that some recovery crews would die doing exactly this, and that the tanks they recovered would be worth more than the men they lost. The mathematics of attrition in Normandy worked differently for each side, and the Germans understood this before the Americans did. A panther that threw a track during a fighting withdrawal was abandoned, not because the crew lacked skill or courage, but because there was no way to recover it. The Berge Panthers were too few, the fuel too scarce. There was never enough time. The crew would strip what they could, machine guns, optical sights, anything portable, and then thermite the engine block and walk toward the next defensive line. The tank they left behind represented 18 months of industrial effort, from the Krupp steel mill to the MAN assembly plant to the rail yard at Caen. 18 months of metallurgy and machining and precision assembly and final inspection, abandoned in a Norman field because the Wehrmacht could not build enough recovery vehicles to drag it to safety. The Americans would find it the next morning, still warm, and their ordnance teams would strip it for intelligence before bulldozing it into a ditch. The Sherman that Hessler's crew recovered reached a field maintenance company before sunset. The fire had burned out the engine compartment, wiring harness melted, fuel lines destroyed, the Continental radial reduced to a block of fused aluminum and steel. The hull was intact. The running gear was intact. The turret traverse mechanism still functioned. The 75mm gun had not been touched. A maintenance crew removed the destroyed power pack with an M32's boom, dropped in a replacement from the parts stockpile, reconnected the controls, and test-fired the engine. The tank was back in service 41 hours after Krauss put a round through it. No amount of German tactical excellence could close this gap. A panzer commander could be brilliant. His crew veterans of Kursk and Kharkov, who had killed dozens of Allied tanks across 3 years of war. His vehicle could be mechanically superior in every measurable way. Thicker armor, better gun, superior optics, more sophisticated fire control. None of it mattered if his tank broke down during a retreat and no one came to get it. The loss was permanent. The replacement, if it came at all, would arrive in weeks or months. The crew would be reassigned to infantry or given a vehicle stripped from a training unit, and the cumulative expertise they had built over years of combat would be diluted or lost entirely. The American system assumed losses. German planners could not accept this because their own doctrine was built around preventing losses rather than absorbing them. The Ordnance Corps calculated that a Sherman in active combat had a statistical lifespan measured in weeks, not months. They planned for this. They built recovery vehicles to retrieve the carcasses. They established forward repair depots within artillery range of the front. They stockpiled engines, transmissions, track assemblies, gun tubes, everything needed to rebuild a knocked-out tank from its surviving components. The planning was not optimistic. It was brutally realistic about what combat would cost, and it was designed to make those costs temporary rather than permanent. By August of 1944, the numbers had become grotesque. American armored divisions were reporting tank losses in the hundreds. Shermans knocked out by Panthers, by POC 40 guns, by Panzerfausts, by mines, by mechanical failure. The raw casualty figures looked catastrophic, but the return to service rates told a different story. 70% of knocked-out Shermans were recovered. Of those, more than half were repaired and returned to combat within 72 hours. The American tank fleet was not shrinking. It was regenerating faster than the Germans could destroy it. The Germans had no equivalent statistic because they had no equivalent system. A Wehrmacht armored division that lost 30 tanks in a week's fighting might recover 5 of them. The rest stayed where they fell, burned hulks marking the line of advance, monuments to an industrial base that could build magnificent vehicles but could not sustain them. Speer's production figures showed German tank output climbing through 1944, reaching record levels in the autumn months. But production without recovery is a one-way flow. Every tank that left the factory was a countdown to destruction, and when the countdown reached 0, that investment was gone. One of the Foreign Military Studies reports, this one written by a former Panzer Division logistics officer, contains an inventory of vehicles lost during the retreat from Falaise. The division abandoned 11 Panthers, 8 Panzer IVs, and 3 Tigers in a single week. Of these, 7 were combat losses, destroyed by enemy fire, beyond any possible repair. The other 15 were mechanical failures or minor damage that would have been recoverable with adequate resources. They thermited them all. The officer's summary uses language that borders on bitterness. We were forced to destroy vehicles that required only track replacement or engine repair because no means existed to evacuate them. That phrase, no means existed, captures the asymmetry. The means existed. The Americans had built them, tested them, shipped them across an ocean, and deployed them in sufficient numbers to assign dozens to every armored division. The Germans knew these vehicles existed. They had captured examples. They had studied the doctrine. They understood what the Americans were doing. But understanding a system and replicating it are different things, and by the summer of 1944, the German industrial base could not produce enough tanks to keep the Panzer divisions at strength, let alone divert production to build recovery vehicles that would never fire a shot. The war Krauss was fighting, 1 gun, 1 engagement, 1 killed Sherman, was a tactical success. The war the Americans were fighting was something else entirely. They were not trying to win individual engagements. They were trying to make individual engagements irrelevant. The tow cable that Hessler attached to the Sherman shackle was manufactured by the American Chain and Cable Company at their plant in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It was one of 14,000 identical cables produced in a single month of 1944, each one wound onto a spool, packed in a wooden crate, and loaded onto a rail car bound for the port of Philadelphia. From there, a Liberty ship carried it across the Atlantic in a convoy that lost 2 vessels, 2 U-boats south of Iceland. The cable reached Cherbourg 3 weeks after D-Day and sat in a depot for 11 days before being issued to an ordnance company supporting the 2nd Armored Division. The journey from Pennsylvania Steel Mill to Normandy Field covered 4,000 miles and involved 17 separate handling points. The Germans could trace this chain. They had captured manifests, interrogated prisoners, photographed the markings on American equipment. They understood that every piece of American material represented a logistical thread stretching back across an ocean to an industrial base they could not touch. What they could not grasp was the density of the web, how many threads there were, how quickly broken ones could be replaced. The entire system had been designed to absorb losses that would cripple any European army. The Sherman that Hessler's crew recovered needed more than an engine to return to service. It needed a wiring harness manufactured in Detroit, fuel lines from a supplier in Ohio, gaskets, seals, belts, hoses, dozens of components that had to travel the same 4,000 miles before a mechanic could install them. Every one of those components existed in a depot within 20 miles of the front line. The Ordnance Corps had calculated consumption rates for every part on a Sherman and shipped them forward in quantities sufficient to rebuild the entire divisional tank fleet from scratch, twice. A German maintenance officer captured near Mortain described the system during interrogation. The transcript survives in the Military Intelligence Service files. "We knew the Americans had supplies," he said. "Every army has supplies. What we did not understand was that they had planned for us to destroy their equipment. They expected it. They had built their entire maintenance system around the assumption that we would kill their tanks, and they did not care." He did not care is too simple. They cared. The men in those tanks cared. The recovery crews who walked into fire to retrieve them cared. But the system was built to function regardless of individual outcomes. A dead Sherman was not a tragedy to the Ordnance Corps. It was a data point, one more unit cycling through a repair pipeline that had been stress-tested and scaled to handle losses that would bankrupt the Wehrmacht. The cable Hessler used that day was replaced within 48 hours. The Sherman it recovered was repaired within 41. The crew that had bailed out of the burning tank was reassigned to a replacement vehicle that arrived from the depot the following morning. A factory-fresh Sherman with 17 miles on the odometer, shipped from the Chrysler plant in Detroit 6 weeks earlier. The crew climbed in, adjusted their seats, checked their weapons, and drove back to the line. The German round that had killed their first tank had cost the Americans nothing permanent. Krauss fired twice more that week. He hit a Stuart light tank on Tuesday and an M8 armored car on Thursday. Both were recovered. The Stuart required a new transmission, installed in 19 hours. The armored car needed only track repair. 2 hours of work for a maintenance section that had done the job so many times they no longer consulted the manual. By the end of August, Krauss's battery had been overrun during the Falaise withdrawal. The gun he had served since Normandy was captured intact. The Americans found it with ammunition still in the ready rack, abandoned because there was no vehicle to tow it and no fuel to move it if there had been. Krauss walked east with what remained of his crew, joining the stream of Wehrmacht soldiers retreating toward the German border. He survived the war. Most of his battery did not. The recovery crews kept working, through the hedgerows, through the breakout, through the pursuit across France. They hooked up burning tanks in the rain outside Saint-Lô. They winched overturned Shermans out of ditches near Argenton. They dragged knocked-out vehicles through the streets of Chartres, while French civilians watched from doorways. The procedure never changed. Dismount, walk forward, hook up, signal, walk back. The cable connected the front line to Pennsylvania, to Detroit, to the shipyards of Richmond and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Every tank they recovered was a message sent backward through that chain. Send more. The Germans received no such messages. Their cables frayed and their winches broke. Their Panthers burned out their engines, towing vehicles twice their weight, and there were no replacements waiting. The industrial system that had built the Wehrmacht's magnificent tanks could not sustain them in the field, and by autumn of 1944, the Panzer divisions were consuming themselves faster than Speer's factories could replenish them. Hessler did not know he was part of a system spanning a continent. He knew his job. Walk forward, hook up, walk back. Do not run. Do not hesitate. Trust the equipment and the doctrine. Trust that someone, somewhere, had thought this through. Someone had. 73%. That was the return to service rate for American medium tanks in the European theater of operations between June and December of 1944. 73% of every Sherman, knocked out by enemy fire, mechanical failure, mine strike, or crew error, came back. The Ordnance Corps tracked these numbers with the same precision they applied to ammunition consumption and fuel expenditure. A tank was an asset. An asset had a status. The status was updated daily, forwarded to division, aggregated at corps level, and compiled into reports that reached Washington within the week. The German equivalent number does not exist, not because the Wehrmacht failed to track their vehicles. German staff work remained meticulous, even as the army collapsed around it, but because the concept of return to service had ceased to have meaning. A Panzer IV that threw a final drive in Belgium was not recovered, repaired, and returned. It was stripped, abandoned, and counted as destroyed. The paperwork classified it as a total loss because that was the only category that matched reality. There was no column for awaiting recovery because nothing was coming to recover it. By October of 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had lost 187 medium tanks since landing in Normandy. Combat losses mostly. 88mm rounds through turret faces, Panzerfaust hits at close range, catastrophic ammunition fires that left nothing but a burned hull and 5 sets of dog tags to send home. 187 tanks in 4 months of continuous operations. The division ended October with more Shermans than it had possessed on D-Day. Look at that sentence again. They lost 187 tanks and finished with more than they started. The depot system had not merely replaced their losses, it had increased their strength while absorbing casualties that would have destroyed a German formation twice over. Every knocked-out Sherman that could be dragged to a repair facility became 2 or 3 Shermans because the parts stockpile held enough components to rebuild the vehicle and still have spares left over for the next one. The recovery crews were not just saving tanks, they were multiplying them. The Panzer Lehr Division experienced the same period differently. They had landed in Normandy with nearly 200 tanks and assault guns. A full-strength armored division, one of the best-equipped formations the Wehrmacht possessed. By the time they retreated across the Seine, they had fewer than 30 operational vehicles. The losses were not primarily from combat. American fighters and artillery had killed some. Shermans and tank destroyers had killed others. But the largest category in the division's loss reports was mechanical failure, unrecoverable, transmissions that burned out during forced marches, engines that seized from contaminated fuel, track assemblies that failed from metal fatigue. The Panthers and Tigers were breaking down faster than the crews could fix them, and there was no system to catch the carcasses. A German tanker from Panzer Lehr. His name appears in the interrogation files as Gefreiter Wilhelm Pohl, described the autumn of '44 in terms that sound almost hallucinatory. His unit had been reduced to 4 operational tanks from an original strength of 14. They were ordered to hold a crossroads near Aachen, while waiting for reinforcements that existed only on paper. American armor appeared on the morning of the 3rd day. Pohl counted 11 Shermans moving in column toward their position. His commander engaged and destroyed 2 of them before a mechanical failure locked the turret traverse. They abandoned the Panther and walked toward the German lines. When Pohl looked back, he saw American half-tracks already moving toward the Shermans his unit had just killed. They were hooking them up, he told his interrogator. Before the smoke had cleared, before we were out of rifle range, they did not even wait. The interrogator noted that Pohl seemed less angry than exhausted. He had been fighting for 5 months against an enemy that did not stay dead. Every tank he killed came back. Every tank he lost was gone forever. The mathematics were not difficult. He had understood for weeks that his side was losing. What he had not understood, what none of them had understood, was that the war had been decided before the first shot was fired. The outcome was built into the logistics tables and production schedules, into the shipping manifests that moved 14,000 tow cables from Pennsylvania to Normandy in a single month. Pohl's skill and his years of training on the Eastern Front, none of it mattered against arithmetic. The last Panzer offensive of the war would come 2 months later in the Ardennes. The Germans would commit everything they had left, every tank and gallon of hoarded fuel, every replacement crew scraped from training battalions and convalescent hospitals. They would achieve tactical surprise and initial success. They would destroy American tanks by the dozens in the opening days. And then the offensive would stall, not because the Americans fought better or had superior vehicles, but because the German tanks broke down and no one came to get them, while American recovery crews worked through the snow to drag every damaged Sherman back to the depots that were already full of replacement engines. The machinery of recovery kept working, cables unreeling, winches turning, half-tracks rolling forward into smoke and fire, because someone in Washington had looked at the numbers years earlier and understood that this war would be won by the side that could absorb more losses, not the side that could prevent them. 14:23 hours, Norman time. Hessler finishes threading the cable through the Sherman's tow shackle. His hands are steady. The German gun that killed this tank is still out there. He can see the hedgerow where the muzzle flash came from, maybe 300 meters to the east. The crew of that gun is watching him right now. They have watched him walk forward, kneel in the mud, and attach a cable to a vehicle they just destroyed. They have not fired again. The interrogation files suggest why. German gunners in Normandy reported confusion about American recovery operations. Not tactical confusion, but something closer to disbelief. A PaK 40 crew captured near Villers-Bocage told their interrogator that they had killed a Sherman, and then watched an American half-track drive directly toward the burning wreck. "We thought it was a mistake," the gun commander said. "We thought they had not seen us. We waited for them to realize and turn back. They did not turn back." They did not turn back because turning back was not in the doctrine. The Ordnance Corps had calculated that a recovery vehicle approaching a knocked-out tank under fire had a 19% chance of being hit. 19%. The math said that for every 5 attempts, 4 would succeed. 4 tanks recovered, repaired, returned to service. 1 recovery vehicle lost. The arithmetic favored aggression, so the doctrine mandated aggression. and the men who executed the doctrine learned to stop thinking about the 19%. Hessler signals. The M-32's driver sees his arm come up and engages the winch. The cable goes taut. Steel creaks against steel as the Sherman shifts in the mud, its dead weight resisting for a moment before beginning to slide backward. Smoke still pours from the engine deck. The fire has burned through the fuel lines and is working on the ammunition storage now. If the rounds cook off, Hessler will be standing 15 feet from 37 rounds of 75mm ammunition detonating simultaneously. He does not move. The procedure says, stay with the cable until the vehicle is clear of the immediate area. He stays with the cable. The Sherman comes free. It slides backward through the churned earth, dragging a furrow in the mud, trailing smoke like a wounded animal being hauled to safety. Hessler walks alongside it, one hand on the hull, guiding it clear of a shell crater that would have fouled the tow. The German gun still does not fire. They might be out of ammunition or repositioning, or they simply cannot process what they are seeing. An American soldier walking calmly beside a burning tank while under observation, treating the recovery as routine, because to him it is routine. The M-32 pulls the Sherman behind a low rise, out of the German line of sight. Hessler finally breaks contact, jogging the last 20 meters to the half-track. His crew chief is already on the radio, calling in the recovery to battalion. The Sherman's crew is somewhere behind them. They had bailed out before the fire spread and walked back to the assembly area on their own feet. They will be reassigned to a replacement vehicle by morning. The tank Hessler just recovered will be in a repair depot by sunset. The battalion called them the Magnets. Not an official designation. Nothing in the TO and E or the unit history. Just what the tankers started calling the recovery crews after the third or fourth time they watched an M-32 drive straight into fire to drag out a wreck. The name stuck. It spread to other units, other divisions. By the autumn of '44, recovery crews across the ETO were being called Magnets, and most of them did not know where the name came from. Hessler knew. He had been there when a tank commander from the 66th Armored Regiment used it for the first time. The man's Sherman had been hit twice in 1 week, both times recovered, both times repaired. The second time, Hessler's crew had hooked up the burning tank while a German machine gun walked rounds across the field toward them. When they got back to the assembly area, the tank commander was waiting. He looked at Hessler for a long moment, then said, "You people are magnets. Bullets should be hitting you, and they just don't." The bullets did hit them sometimes. The 19% was real. Recovery crews died doing exactly what Hessler had just done, walking forward into fire, trusting the statistics, and landing on the wrong side of the odds. Their names went into the same casualty reports as the tank crews they were trying to save. The Ordnance Corps did not track them separately. A loss was a loss. But the system kept working. That was the point. Individual outcomes did not matter to the machine, only aggregate performance. 73% of tanks recovered. 81% of those returned to service. The pipeline flowed from Pennsylvania to Normandy, to the front line and back again, an endless loop of destruction and repair that no individual death could interrupt. The Germans could kill Hessler tomorrow, and the M-32 would still roll forward the day after. A different crew working the same procedure, the cable connecting the same industrial system to the same battlefield math. Hessler climbs back into the half-track. His uniform smells like burning oil and cordite. The driver is already turning the vehicle around, heading back toward the battalion maintenance area. There will be another call within the hour. There is always another call. A Sherman burning in a field, a crew walking back to find a replacement, a cable to hook up. The radio crackles. Hessler reaches for it.